In the spring of 2006, a contractor renovating an abandoned farmhouse in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, pulled up rotted floorboards in what used to be a bedroom. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth and pressed flat by decades of weight, he found a leather journal. The pages were brittle, brown at the edges, written in a neat hand that grew shakier toward the end. The entry stopped abruptly in 1889. Inside the front cover, a name, Reverend Samuel Hollins. Inside the back, a list of names, all women, all crossed out. The contractor called the County Historical Society. They read 3 pages, then locked it away. They said it wasn't for public record, but someone made a copy, and that copy found its way to the right hands. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Calloway family lived on a ridge so remote it didn't appear on county maps until 1912. The land was theirs by inheritance, passed down from a Revolutionary War grant that nobody else wanted. Steep, rocky, shaded by oak and hickory so thick the sun only touched the ground at noon. The nearest town was Pikeville, 11 miles down a trail that washed out every spring. Most folks in the valley knew the Calloways existed, but nobody went up there. Not for trade, not for church, not even to check on them when the winters got long. There were 4 brothers, Amos, the eldest, born in 1853, then Caleb, Ezra, and the youngest, Josiah, born in 1862. Their father died when Josiah was still a boy. Their mother, a woman named Miriam, lived until 1878. After that, the brothers had the ridge to themselves. No roads, no law, no pastor except the one they decided to become. They kept to themselves. But people in Pikeville noticed things. Every few years, a cousin would go missing. A girl, usually. Somewhere between 14 and 18. The family would say she'd married into another county, or gone west, or died of fever. But no one ever saw a body. No one ever got a letter. By 1883, there were 9 women living on that ridge. All of them were Calloways by birth. All of them had married into the family without ever leaving it. The brothers had taken their cousins as wives, sometimes more than one, and when those unions produced daughters, they waited. The oldest girl, a child named Mercy, turned 13 that summer. Amos had already announced she would be his second wife before the snow came. There was no ceremony anyone outside the ridge would recognize. No county clerk, no marriage license filed in Pikeville or anywhere else. What they did by their own authority, under their own interpretation of Scripture. Amos called himself a patriarch. He said the blood had to stay pure, that God had given them the ridge as a covenant, and that any man who let his seed scatter beyond the family line was no better than Cain wandering in the land of Nod. He kept a Bible on the table, open to Genesis, where he'd underlined passages about begetting in thick black ink. The house they lived in was built from chestnut logs, 2 stories, with a stone chimney that smoked day and night. The windows were narrow, covered with oilcloth in winter. Inside, the walls were bare except for one thing, wooden plaques carved with the names of every child born on that ridge. 37 names by 1888. 23 of them had died before their 5th birthday. The brothers never buried them in town. They dug graves on the north side of the property, where the ground stayed soft, and marked them with river stones. Ezra was the one who kept the records. He wrote down every birth, every death, every marriage in a ledger he stored in a metal box beneath his bed. He noted deformities, stillbirths, seizures, blindness. He wrote it all in the same calm hand, like he was recording weather patterns. There was no shame in the writing, no hesitation, just facts. In the margins, sometimes, he would add a verse, something about trials, about faith being tested, about Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac because God had asked. The women rarely spoke, according to the one account we have. Reverend Hollins, the pastor from Pikeville, visited the ridge once in 1887 after a cousin in town begged him to check on her sister. He wrote that the women moved like shadows, that they kept their eyes down and their hands folded, that when he asked one of them her name, she looked at Amos before answering. He said the house smelled like tallow and sickness, and that the children who could walk clung to the walls like they were afraid of open space. He didn't stay long. He said a prayer, left a hymnal, and rode back down the ridge before dark. In his journal, he wrote, "I fear what I have seen, but I fear more what I did not." In the winter of 1888, something changed. A traveling peddler named Thomas Kern passed through Pikeville selling tin goods and medicine. He mentioned he'd seen smoke coming from the Calloway Ridge, but no one came down to trade. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what he said next. He'd heard singing, not hymns, not anything he recognized. A low, droning sound that seemed to come from the ground itself, like the ridge was breathing. He said it made his horse nervous, and he didn't stop. 2 months later, a girl appeared in Pikeville. Her name was Ruth. She was 16, barefoot, and her dress was torn at the hem. She walked into the general store just after dawn and asked for the sheriff. There wasn't one. The closest thing to law was a county magistrate named Horace Dunn who came through once a month. The storekeeper, a man named Virgil Pace, sat her down and gave her water. She drank 3 cups without stopping. Then she told him she'd run from the ridge, that she'd waited until the brothers were asleep, climbed out a window, and walked through the woods all night. She said she couldn't go back, that if they found her, they'd put her in the cellar. Virgil asked her what was in the cellar. She didn't answer right away. She looked at her hands, which were scratched and dirty, and then she said, "The ones who tried to leave before me." Virgil wrote a letter to Magistrate Dunn that same day. Dunn arrived in Pikeville 4 days later and took Ruth's statement. She told him there were 9 women on the ridge, but only 6 of them could still speak. The others had gone silent. Not mute, they could make sounds, but they'd stopped forming words. She said Amos called it the quieting, and that it happened to women who questioned him. He said it was God taking their voices because they'd sinned in their hearts. Ruth said it wasn't God, it was fear. She described the daily routine. The brothers woke before dawn and prayed for an hour, all of them on their knees in the main room. The women prepared meals in silence. Cornmeal mush, salted pork, potatoes when they had them. The children ate separately, in the loft, and weren't allowed to speak during meals. After breakfast, the men worked the land, clearing timber, tending a small plot of corn, repairing fences that didn't keep anything in or out. The women sewed, cleaned, and cared for the youngest children, most of whom couldn't walk properly. Ruth said some of the babies were born wrong, twisted spines, cleft palates, fingers fused together. Amos said it was a test of faith, that Job had suffered worse, but it was the nights Ruth talked about most. She said that after dark, the brothers would gather in the main room and read scripture aloud for hours. Caleb would play a dulcimer, the same 3 chords over and over, and the women were required to sit and listen. If anyone fell asleep, Ezra would wake them with a leather strap. Ruth said the music didn't sound like worship. It sounded like a spell. Magistrate Dunn organized a party of 6 men to ride up to the Calloway Ridge. It was late March, 1889, and the trail was still half mud. They brought rifles, not because they expected trouble, but because no one knew what they'd find. Dunn had sent word ahead through a cousin in town, letting the Calloways know he was coming to conduct an inquiry. He wanted it to be official, legal. He didn't want it to be a raid. They reached the property just after noon. The house sat in a clearing surrounded by stumps and pig fence. Smoke rose from the chimney. A few chickens scratched in the dirt. It looked like any other hardscrabble farm, except for the quiet. No dogs barking, no children playing, just the wind moving through the trees and the creak of the porch board settling. Amos met them at the door. He was tall, lean, with a dark beard shot through with gray. He wore a black coat and a hat with a narrow brim. His hands were clean, his voice was calm. He invited them inside like they were expected guests. The main room was dim, lit by a single window and the glow from the fireplace. The walls were scrubbed bare. The floor was swept. Everything in its place. Dunn counted 5 women sitting on benches against the far wall. None of them looked up. None of them moved. Dunn asked where the others were. Amos said 2 were upstairs tending to the sick, and 2 were in the root cellar fetching preserves. He said it so smoothly that Dunn almost didn't press. But one of the men with him, a farmer named Bill Trent, had noticed something. The women on the bench, they weren't blinking, not often enough. They stared straight ahead like they were watching something no one else could see. Dunn asked to speak with Ruth's mother. A woman named Abigail. Amos said she'd taken ill and couldn't come down. Dunn said he'd go up. Amos didn't argue. He led them to the stairs, narrow and steep, and gestured for Dunn to go first. At the top, there was a hallway with 3 doors. Behind the first, they found 2 women lying on a straw mattress. One of them was Abigail. Her hair was gray. Her face was gaunt. She looked at Dunn but didn't speak. The other woman was younger, maybe 20, and she rocked back and forth, humming the same low note Ruth had described. Dunn asked Abigail if she wanted to leave. She shook her head. Not quickly, just once. Like the question didn't make sense. They checked the other rooms. One was full of children, 7 of them, all under 10. Some were playing with cornhusk dolls, others just sat. Dunn noticed that 3 of them had the same strange look in their eyes, pale and unfocused, like they were looking past the world. The 3rd room was locked. Amos said it was storage. Dunn asked him to open it. Amos took a key from his coat pocket, slow and deliberate, and turned the lock. Inside was a bed, a chair, a small table, and on the table, a brown hat, a woman's hat, old-fashioned, with a ribbon that had faded to the color of dust. Dunn recognized it. It had belonged to a girl named Sarah Calloway, who'd gone missing in 1881. Her mother had described it to him once, years ago, when she'd come asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Dunn asked Amos where Sarah was. Amos said she'd passed. Fever, he said. They'd buried her on the north side like all the others. Dunn asked why they'd kept her hat. Amos didn't answer right away. He looked at the hat like he was remembering something, then said it was a comfort to the children, that they liked to hold things that had belonged to the ones who'd gone before. Dunn asked to see the graves. Amos agreed. They walked out past the pig fence, through a stretch of clearing where the ground sloped down toward a line of pines. The graves were there, marked with river stones, some of them so small they could have been for animals. Dunn counted 42. Amos stood with his hands folded, watching. Dunn asked if he kept a record of who was buried where. Amos said Ezra did, that he wrote everything down. Dunn asked to see it. Back inside, Ezra brought out the ledger. It was thick, bound in leather, the pages filled with names and dates in careful script. Dunn read through it slowly. Most of the entries were children, stillborn, died in infancy, fever, fits, failure to thrive, but scattered among them were others. Women, Sarah Calloway, died 1882. Naomi Calloway, died 1884. Leah Calloway, died 1886. All of them young. All of them listed as fever or childbirth or affliction of the blood. No doctor had ever been called. No one outside the family had ever seen the bodies. Dunn asked if he could speak to the women alone. Amos said they wouldn't speak without him present, that it wasn't proper. Dunn insisted. Amos finally agreed, but only if Caleb stayed in the room. Dunn didn't like it, but he didn't have the authority to force it. He sat down across from the women and asked them simple questions. Did they want to leave? Did they feel safe? Were they being held against their will? The women stared at him. One of them, the youngest, opened her mouth like she might answer, but before she could, Caleb cleared his throat. The sound was soft, barely audible, but the girl closed her mouth and looked down. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your family. Dunn knew he wasn't going to get anywhere, not like this, not with the brothers watching. He thanked them for their time and told Amos he'd be back with a county official who had more authority. Amos nodded. He walked them to the door and stood on the porch as they mounted their horses. As they rode down the trail, Bill Trent looked back. He said later that he saw Amos standing there, still as a post, until they disappeared into the trees. And behind him, in the window, he saw a small hand pressed against the glass, a child's hand. It stayed there long after they were gone. Dunn filed his report with the county court in Pikeville. He recommended a formal investigation and the removal of any women or children who wished to leave. But before anything could be done, summer came, and with it, the silence. In July of 1889, a farmer named Eli Moss was hunting deer on the lower ridge when he smelled smoke, not cook-fire smoke, something heavier, sweeter. He followed it uphill until he could see the Calloway house through the trees. The smoke was coming from behind it, near the graves. He got closer, staying low, and saw Caleb and Josiah feeding something into a fire. They were using a pitchfork, lifting bundles wrapped in cloth and dropping them into the flames. The bundles were small, child-sized. Eli didn't stay to watch. He ran back down the ridge and rode straight to Pikeville. He found Dunn at the courthouse and told him what he'd seen. Dunn gathered the same men from before, plus 2 others, and they rode up that same day. This time they didn't send word ahead. When they arrived, the fire was still burning. The brothers were gone, but the smell remained. Dunn and his men circled the house, calling out, but no one answered. The front door was open. Inside, the main room was empty. The benches were still there, lined against the wall, but the women were gone. So were the children. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. On the table sat the Bible, still open to Genesis. And beside it, a knife. Clean, freshly sharpened. They searched the house room by room. Upstairs, the beds were made. The locked room was open now, and empty except for the brown hat, still sitting on the table. In the loft where the children slept, they found corn-husk dolls arranged in a circle, like someone had been playing and then stopped mid-game. Downstairs, in the corner near the root cellar door, they found a smear of blood on the floorboards. Not much, just enough to notice. Bill Trent opened the cellar door. The smell that came up was earth and rot and something else, something human. He called for a lantern. Dunn brought one down, and they descended the stone steps into the dark. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet across, with a dirt floor and shelves lined with jars of preserves. In the back corner, there was a wooden partition, like a stall. Behind it, they found her. She was young, maybe 17. Her wrists were bound with rope. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes were open, but she didn't react when they spoke to her. Dinah cut the ropes and carried her up into the light. She didn't fight, didn't cry, just stared. One of the men wrapped her in a coat and tried to get her to drink water, but she wouldn't swallow. Her lips moved, like she was trying to form words, but no sound came. Later, they would learn her name was Dinah. She was Amos's daughter, and she'd been in that cellar for 19 days. They found 2 others in the smokehouse, both dead, wrapped in the same cloth Eli had seen burning. They were women, though it was hard to tell at first. The bodies had been there long enough that the heat and the flies had done their work. Dunn didn't unwrap them fully. He'd seen enough. He sent one of the men to ride for the county coroner and told the others to search the woods. They found the brothers 3 days later, camped in a hollow 2 miles east of the ridge. They hadn't run far. They hadn't tried to hide. They were sitting around a fire, eating Johnny cakes and drinking from a clay jug like they were on a hunting trip. When Dunn and his men approached, Amos stood up slowly, brushed the crumbs from his coat, and asked if they'd come to pray with them. Dunn arrested all 4. They didn't resist, didn't argue. Caleb asked if they could bring the Bible. Dunn said no. On the ride back to Pikeville, Amos talked the entire time. Not to Dunn, not to anyone in particular. He recited scripture from memory, verse after verse, his voice steady and certain. He said they'd done what God required, that the bloodline had to be kept pure or the covenant would be broken, that the women who died had been weak in faith, and the children who were born broken were tests they had failed. He said it without emotion, like he was reading from Ezra's ledger. The women and children who survived were taken to Pikeville and housed with relatives who still lived in town. Most of them never spoke about what happened on the ridge. Dinah recovered enough to walk, but she never said a word again. She lived with an aunt until 1903, when she disappeared one winter night. They found her body in the spring, at the base of a cliff near the old Calloway property. The coroner ruled it an accident, but her aunt said she'd been walking in her sleep for years, always heading uphill, always toward the ridge. The brothers were tried in September of 1889. The trial lasted 2 days. The county prosecutor presented Ezra's ledger, the testimony of the men who'd searched the property, and the coroner's report on the 2 bodies found in the smokehouse. The defense argued that the Calloways had lived according to their religious beliefs and that the state had no right to interfere with a man's family or his faith. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Amos, Caleb, and Ezra were sentenced to hang. Josiah, the youngest, was given life in prison on account of his age and the testimony of one of the surviving women who said he'd tried to help her once and been beaten for it. The hangings were carried out in Pikeville on October 9, 1889. A crowd of 200 people came to watch. Amos was the last to drop. Before the rope went around his neck, he asked to say something. The magistrate allowed it. Amos looked out at the crowd and said, "We kept the blood pure. You'll see. When the world falls to ruin and the impure are cast out, you'll wish you'd done the same." Then he closed his eyes, and they pulled the lever. The house on the ridge was burned the following spring. The graves were left alone, though no one ever found out who planted wild roses over them. By 1900, the property had been reclaimed by the state and sold to a logging company. The trees were cut, the land stripped, and within 20 years, there was nothing left to show the Calloways had ever lived there except the stones. Reverend Hollins's journal remained locked away until 1998, when a historian researching Bledsoe County families requested access. The Historical Society denied the request. They said the material was too sensitive, but the copied pages that circulated told enough. In his final entry, dated November 1889, Hollins wrote, "I have prayed for understanding and received only silence. I have prayed for peace and felt only dread. If faith can justify what I saw on that ridge, then I no longer know what faith is. God forgive me, I wish I had never gone." Ruth, the girl who escaped, married a shopkeeper from Chattanooga and lived until 1941. She never returned to Bledsoe County. In her later years, she told her grandchildren that she still dreamed about the ridge, that in the dreams she could hear the dulcimer playing, the same 3 chords, over and over, and that when she tried to run, the ground beneath her feet turned soft, like she was walking on graves. She said the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the certainty. The brothers had believed, truly believed, that what they were doing was holy, and in that belief, there was no room for mercy. The Calloway name disappeared from Bledsoe County records after 1910. No descendants claimed the family name. No one erected markers. The ridge is still there, overgrown now, accessible only by foot. Hunters occasionally report strange sounds, low, droning hums that seem to rise from the earth itself. Others say they've found stones arranged in circles, or felt watched when no one else was around. The County Historical Society won't confirm or deny the existence of Hollins's journal. They say it's a matter of respecting the dead, but the dead don't rest easy on that ridge, and the living who know the story don't talk about it after dark. If you made it this far, you've heard something most people never will. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think. And remember, some bloodlines were never meant to continue.